no one is even subtle about it. It's no secret of how many fossil fuel lobbyists are at the COP. It's no secret of how many fossil fuel lobbyists pay huge sums to conservative politicians and so on. So it's not is happening in plain sight.
Let me ask one. No, that was great. That was a great summary. Let me just ask one quick follow-up question. What's that?
It's Galileo.
Welcome.
I
like
forgot to bring my prop.
Yeah, I don't have. I'm gonna come up with something. So one quick
Wait,
follow-up
hold on.
question.
I have this.
Okay, you hold on. You're gonna bring that out when it's your turn. You can have that just come in the middle at a good time. Hi, and welcome to COPOut, apocalyptically optimistic climate conversations with people who know stuff. I'm Dana Fisher, the director of the Center for Environment, Community, and Equity at American University, and I am here today with two amazing colleagues and friends who do really important work around climate science. So we're going to specifically talk today about the work that they're doing at the forefront of measuring and attributing the effects of climate change and the way that it's having an effect on our world. So I thought we would get started just by giving you each a chance to talk briefly about kind of how you got to doing what you do now. I mean, you both work on measuring carbon and the effects of climate change in different ways. But I thought maybe you could talk a little bit briefly about each of your paths to getting to doing that work and how you ended up doing the work that you're specifically doing now. Freddie, you want to go first?
Okay. Thank you, Dana. So, yeah, I'm Friederike Otto. I'm now a professor in climate science at Imperial College London, and my claim to fame is that I'm running an initiative that's called World Weather Attribution, and I've been running that for over 10 years now. And what we do with World Weather Attribution is we answer the question, what's the role of climate change in an extreme weather event? And we try and do that as quickly as possible in the immediate aftermath of the event occurring. So within days or weeks of the event occurring. And the reason for doing that is that even 10 years ago, when we started World Weather Attribution, there was always the question around climate change when extreme weather events happened. But at that time, every journalist and every scientist would say, yeah, that sort of could be the kind of thing that we see with climate change, but we can't attribute individual weather events to climate change. And even 10 years ago, that wasn't true anymore because, and I guess we can talk about that a bit more in detail later, we can attribute individual weather events to climate change, and we can actually say for a lot of different types of events of how much more likely or how much more intense or how much less intense a particular cold wave, heat wave, tropical cyclone is because of climate change. And to get this scientific evidence into the public conversation that is happening around extreme weather events, we founded World Weather Attribution 10 years ago to do this science as quickly as possible. And that's what we did. And it worked amazingly well.
Let me ask one. No, that was great. That was a great summary. Freddie, one quick follow-up question. So, can you talk a little bit about how you use the attribution work that you do to connect with policymakers or policymaking? If you do, have you found a way to use that work to plug into the policymaking process at all?
A bit, yeah. And mainly, I would say policymaking at a local and national level. So we have, from the start, one of the key partners of World Weather Attribution is the Red Cross, so the Red Cross Climate Center. And one of the key reasons that we work with them is because, of course, they have a super great network across the world of people who work on the ground who can actually help us figuring out what has happened, when did it rain, where, how much, and who were the people who were most affected. But of course, they also have a great network of local decision makers. So what we have done this a few times, but what we are increasingly doing is that so in every study that we do, we have a press briefing where we talk to the media, but we also now often have a policy briefing, which we do not in the immediate aftermath when people obviously on the ground are still busy with cleaning up, helping, saving lives, but a few sort of month or so after the event where we share our results, where we discuss what role did vulnerability play? What was the role of exposure? And so try and have conversations about building back better. And so I mean, it's always very hard to measure the impact of that. So how much of our conversations have then really led to actual impacts? I mean, we have some examples where then that also went on a national level. So the Kenyan president has cited our work when he addressed the nation, when he addressed COP last year. We have had in the German parliament, our work has been cited and used as a reason to justify having heat action plans. So the evidence is a bit anecdotal because it's hard to measure, but we are trying to have these conversations.
Great. So shifting to you, David, can you talk a little bit about how you got to be doing the kind of work that you're doing?
Yeah, but at first, I just like to say, I think what Freddie's doing, the attribution science, is like the most important thing that we could be doing in climate science. And so I think it's really exciting, and I'm excited to be on this show with her. But in terms of what I do, it's a lot more boring. So I've spent my career basically figuring out what controls the rate that gases are exchanged between the atmosphere and the ocean. And that's relevant because this is how the ocean ends up taking, 25% of the CO2 that we put into the atmosphere. And so, the global carbon budget just released their annual estimate of, how much CO2 we put into the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels, how much we put into the atmosphere from land use change, and then how much of that went into the terrestrial biosphere and how much went into the ocean. And one of the methods that they use to figure out how much went into the ocean relies on the work that I've been, spending my career on. So it's like a lot of work to get a little number, but it turns out to be important. But then I've also done a lot of work on understanding the ocean carbon cycle and understanding also what mangroves do, what happens to the carbon that mangroves take up, because some people think that mangroves and salt marshes and seagrass play a big role in taking up CO2 from the atmosphere, what they call blue carbon. And in recent years, I've sort of shifted gear a little bit and used the skills that I've built up to sort of look at the efficacy of ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. So these are techniques that people are trying to deploy to sort of enhance the ocean carbon sink, and so that it would take up even more carbon than it's currently doing. As a climate solution.
So I'm going to ask you the same follow-up question that I asked Freddie. Within this work, I mean, obviously there's a lot of policy relevance to both of your work, but for you, David, have there been places where you've worked with or contributed to decision-making, or the ways, I mean, I know, for example, I believe right now at the COP, there's this whole discussion about how this is the CDR COP, and there's the ways that the regime is going to lean into this. So I'm wondering if you've contributed to or been involved at all in any of the decision-making at any scales around this?
I think the most impactful thing that I've done in that space, and maybe for the rest of my career, is this one-page opinion piece that I wrote that came out in Nature magazine that basically said carbon dioxide removal is not a current climate solution. We have to change the narrative on it. And that message has gotten me invited to talk to the UNFCCC, talk to the European Commission, talk to the general public in climate festivals, but also some different like local and national legislatures from different countries. So I think that's probably, of everything that I've ever done in my career, that's probably the most impactful thing.
Can you remind us? I remember when the piece came out, but I'm trying to remember what year was it? Was 23? Is that right?
23, that's right.
Look at me. And do you feel like, so you spoke to a lot of folks. You spoke to the UNFCCC. You said you spoke to a bunch of other heads of state, etc. Do you feel like what you communicated was absorbed? Did you feel like it had an effect on the conversation or decision making?
It's hard to tell, but certainly I think that no country is 100% relying on carbon dioxide removal as the one thing they're going to do going forward.
But they are spending a huge amount of money on it in many cases. I mean, just thinking about my own country, I mean, of all the money they spend on climate, they spend a huge amount on carbon removal or research on it, but not actually on the things we know work now and that need to happen now.
Yeah.
So isn't that coming quite close to sort of focusing almost 100% on it?
Actually, it might appear that the countries are spending a lot of money because there's so much attention spent on it. I think what's more troubling is the amount of attention we pay to it, both the media and maybe politicians. But in fact, the amount of money spent on decarbonization far outweighs the amount of money spent on research for CDR. So I'm not worried about how money is spent. I'm more worried about how attention is divided.
Well, I'm going to push back here for 1 second, David. I mean, in my country, which I think is it was just your country too, even though I know you're not speaking to us from the United States, where we are not able to get most research money to invest in looking at climate change or climate mitigation. I'm curious, you think even in the United States, more research money is going towards decarbonization than carbon removal technology investment?
By far, yeah, by far.
Is that because you're looking at, whose funding is that? Like corporate funding?
There's actually not a lot of funding going into carbon dioxide removal research, which is the problem, right? Because then companies can just make all these outlandish claims about what their magical solutions can do. And nobody has the funding to check it and to do all the other kinds of research necessary to even develop this as a future climate solution.
Wow, that's interesting. You kind of just convinced me. I usually talk about how the social sciences, I'm a social scientist, get so little of the funding for doing work on climate, even though climate change is a social problem and social processes and changes in social processes is going to be how we solve the problem. But you have convinced me that we do need to invest more money in research on carbon dioxide removal. So kudos to you. I'm not convinced. I mean, I still think we need more money overall, but I can see what you're saying, and that makes sense. So that shifts us to some degree to the next question I wanted to ask, which is about, what you each believe is the best way to address to address climate change right now and the worsening climate crisis. So, what are you working on? And I know, Freddie, you already spoke some about your work around attribution, but can you talk a little more about why it's so important and how it can help get us to the point where we can move forward on addressing climate change in a meaningful way? And then I'll ask you something similar, David.
You have to ask David why attribution is so important, because he said it's
I know.
the most important thing to work on. But I think
we can flip it. I can ask David about attribution. I can ask you about carbon dioxide removal if you want to. It's up to you guys.
So I think why. So you asked. So you started that question with what do I think is the best solution, or what we need to do in order to find better solutions for climate change. And I think what comes out of the attribution work is again and again, and it doesn't matter whether it's events that are like Hurricane Helene that hit the US last year, or Melissa hitting Jamaica and Cuba this year, or whether it's droughts in somewhere else in the world, or heat wave. It's always the poorest who pay the highest price. It's always people with the least money, who are out of sight, out of reach for whatever reason, who are losing their lives, who are losing their livelihoods, who often have many years after extreme events happened still not found back to their feet. And they are the ones who really pay the price for us burning all this carbon. And the best way to help this, to help the victims of climate change right now, is to invest in resilience, to invest in social security, to invest in healthcare, to invest in better infrastructure, better housing infrastructure, all these things. I mean, if we would just do everything where we put the poorest first and ask, okay, for every policy measure that we are taking, be it on mitigation or adaptation, would it make the poorest better off? Would it really help them? We would overall come to the best climate solutions, because it would lead us to insulate homes, to have access to healthcare, to have public transport, and all that is not just helping on adaptation, but also massively reducing the dependency on fossil fuels. And that, I think, is what we see every time when we do a study, that these measures would be the ones that would always be the ones who would avoid the worst.
I mean, I think it's what's really interesting is, in some ways, the kinds of solutions you're talking about, Freddie, are the lowest hanging fruit, because in some ways helping the poorest is the cheapest, because people in poverty, to lift them up out of poverty takes less money than to do some of the fancier things that people are talking about in terms of like infrastructure expansion, et cetera. And yet we don't see those types of efforts taking place in most parts of the world. Any thoughts on how to get that to change?
I mean, that is the big question, right? How do we get that to change? And I think a big part of that is that to do that, we would need to invest into people. Not into stuff. So when you think about how development banks or other agencies like development agencies from Global North, how they plan their budgets, how they spend their money, they have, I don't know, a 3-year budget, and it's very easy to plan a 3-year budget around buying some kit, building a dam or something, where you can then also, whether they are real or not, but you can come up with models, quantitative measures of success. When you instead invest in people, invest in better in people who are, for example, who would be there to maintain and manage and monitor weather stations instead of just the weather stations, that is probably much cheaper, but it is something you have to invest in long term. You have to build relationships. You can't do it when you have always rotating staff in your in the civil servants. And I think that is why, even though it is a low hanging fruit, it's really hard to do with the way we have built our systems at the moment. And that would be an important thing to change, to instead of trying to have lots of small projects or big projects that are short term, to build and invest in long term relationships with people and institutions across the world.
I mean, that's a really good point. I mean, so the work that I've been doing with the Service Corps programs in the United States, where we look at the ways that young people get employed through these service programs for like a year of service. They work on disaster response recovery and building resilience in communities. One of the things that's interesting we've been finding we just are doing the 1-year follow-up with folks who had served in the American Climate Corps, may it rest in peace because it's no more. And many of them talk about the way that, they were doing this work, which was very fine-grained about, monitoring watersheds or helping to support communities after floods or support communities after wildfire. And there was not a lot of support and investment in making sure that these young people enjoy the work, right? And so in a lot of cases, the work really, let's just say it turned them off to doing that kind of work to support these communities, which means, first of all, the communities lose, but also the young people who are developing these skills are not going to continue on that path. And so many of them are like, now I've decided climate, meh, maybe reproductive rights is where I should go. Which, obviously there are lots of problems that people should be focusing their work on, but it is really disheartening to see that. And it's investing in programs like that actually train people to do the kind of work you're talking about, but they need to do it long term. You can't just invest money and throw it in there and be like, oh, we're going to create these programs. Ta-da! We fixed the problem. Resilience is here. Because I think you're exactly right. And that's one of the reasons we've been longitudinally following up with folks to see if it works. And unfortunately, you have to build good programs, not just build programs, even when you do it. David, shifting to you in a slightly different way. Well, I mean, in some ways, I want to ask you, so we need more research on carbon removal, but is carbon removal enough? How do you envision it fitting into the whole suite of climate solutions?
Yeah, so carbon dioxide removal is definitely not enough. And I'm not even sure if it's needed, right? If we're serious about 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees, given the trajectory of things, then we need it. But if we fail at developing a viable carbon dioxide removal technique, we'll probably be okay if we're serious about decarbonization, right? Whereas if it's the other way around, if we're, just continuing to burn fossil fuels and we figure out that, direct air capture works or some ocean method works, it's not going to do anything. And that's actually the point of this piece that I wrote in Nature, is that as long as we're still emitting more than 40 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere every year, no amount of carbon dioxide removal is going to help us at all, right? But with that being said, I mean, there are reasons to research it right now. One is that it takes so long to actually figure out what works and what doesn't, both just in terms of the technology, but also in terms of like the geophysical aspect of it, the environmental aspects, the sociological aspect, the governance of it, and who's going to pay for it, right? I mean, there are so many things that need to be figured out about this that we can't just say, okay, we need this in 2050. We'll let people in the future figure it out, because it will take them decades to get there. And then also, there are things that are maybe more difficult to decarbonize, like aviation or shipping, or some of the industries like cement or fertilizer, and to some extent steel. And so we will probably still have some emissions of greenhouse gases that we need to deal with. So having it, I think it's better than not having it, but it's certainly not enough and not the only thing, like by far.
So I have two completely different questions to follow up. One question is, so the timeline you just laid out makes it sound like viable carbon removal, we're talking about decades. I mean, what's the timeline, do you think, given the trajectory we're on, before carbon dioxide removal it could be a viable component of addressing climate change?
I don't know when technologically people will have figured it out, but I think that before we're at, let's say, 20% of current emissions, which is about, let's say, 8 gigatons of CO2 every year, before we're at that point, it really doesn't make sense to deploy. And when I say deploy, I mean on a large scale, right? This is going to cost trillions of dollars, and really it's going to be a government function, because who has trillions of dollars to spend on something that produces no direct economic benefit, right? So it doesn't make sense to waste our money on something like that, as long as we're still burning fossil fuels for everything.
And then the other question I have, which I think is the flip side of this and relates to what you were just saying, is there's been a discussion that's going on right now about overshoot, right? Which is this idea that we're going to continue to increase concentrations in the atmosphere over what we need to in terms of the carbon budget. And I'm curious if, where you fit in that discussion and if you have a perspective on it.
Well, so I think, yeah, it's sort of a fraught topic, isn't it?
Sorry to put you on the spot.
So
you can just say pass if you want to.
Yeah, it's well. So to get to 1.5, we definitely will go through one of these scenarios, right? One of these overshoot scenarios, and whether it's actually possible to come back from some higher levels of temperature in a reasonable time, I'm not sure. Yeah, it seems very daunting, but that's the purpose of CDR in those scenarios, is to come back from overshoot.
Right. Freddie, do you have a perspective? I mean, I figure I want to loop you in here in case you have a perspective on overshoot. You may not. I'm just curious.
So I think what is really, really important in overshoot is that even if we only overshoot for a short time, if we actually would have figured out a way to come back while we are overshooting, we will still have the impacts of these higher temperatures. So, and that is, I think, something that is never thought about when people talk about overshoot. It's just, oh yeah, it's fine, we'll come back. But of course, we will see, as soon as we have global mean temperatures of 1.6, 1.7 degrees, we will see the heat waves being hotter than they would have been at 1.5. The wind speeds with hurricanes being more intense than they would have been at 1.5. And those damages will occur, and we will not reanimate the people that have lost their lives. And we will not bring the people or the livelihoods or the ecosystems back that we have destroyed by that. So I think what is really important when we talk about overshoot and when we talk about any of these conversations is to remember that global mean temperatures are really just a proxy. And if we just think that it's the end of it all, then we really forget why we are actually talking about climate change, why we're having this COP right now, where we do have the Paris Agreement. It is not an agreement to have some temperature goal that we find nice. It's a human rights treaty. That's why we care, and that's why we need to stay as close as possible to 1.5. And so, yeah, I mean, I would agree with David. I don't think we will manage to not overshoot, but to say, oh, well, let's then just go to 2 because that's the next sort of temperature number next to 1.5 that we can find in the Paris Agreement, and then figure out how to come back later. I think that is a really, really dangerous approach, because 2 is very, very, very far away from 1.5. And so I think if we overshoot 1.5, we should aim for 1.55, and really not think that this is because we will lose so much on the way. And as David has said, we don't even have the technologies. We don't even know if we can come back.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think that in addition to what you were saying, this idea that, not only will there be the lives lost, the expanded, disease vectors, but in addition to that, there'll be all the people who have been forced to move, right? So there'll be this migration and people, concentrations of people moving to other locations because of resource scarcity or, also resource conflicts that will come from the increased concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and the effects of that. So I think it's not just like, okay, we'll just suck it out of the atmosphere and bam, we're okay. It's like now the world has changed, and not just the ecosystems, but the society has changed. And there's a lot of research to make us think that society will not be changing for the better, but rather it'll be, be adding stressors in ways that we are not doing such a great job of handling right now, like migration, for example. But so
Yeah. So
go ahead, David.
Can I just say, I mean, I agree with, everything that Freddie has said, not just about this topic, but before. And, your question about what to do, right? And I think this is why I think the attribution stuff is so important, is because if we're going to hold somebody accountable, we need to be able to attribute these impacts to somebody. And maybe this is controversial among some people, but I think that, the way to stop all these fossil fuel companies from profiting and from just digging up more oil and gas and coal to be burned is to sue them for the damages that they've done. And the way to say, hey, this is what you're responsible for is the work that Freddie and her team are doing. And I think that's super important. And that gives me hope, right, about how we can move on. But otherwise, it's just business as usual. And every year, that emission curve keeps going up, and we just, point out, hey, we're going to lose corals, we're going to lose the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets, we're going to lose permafrost, and we just report these things without actually doing something about it.
Well, actually, that leads me to something I was thinking about asking you, Freddie, that you may not want to talk about, and that is, so I know that your work has been used in some high-profile court cases to target fossil fuel interests of different sorts, and I know there's been pushback around it, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, if you want to, you can say you don't want to talk about this one, but talk about how the work is being used in litigation, and how you see, to the degree that you've been able to gauge, how effective it has been to use the science in this way.
Yeah, so I mean, litigation is a very dirty word. And some people think, oh, if litigation is something that you can't be associated with as a scientist or so, or imply that at least. And I think that's a very dangerous thing to say and to imply, because I mean, what people do in litigation is to insist on their rights. And I think this year has been a really important year for clarifying what some of these rights are. And I think while I would agree that the litigation cases against the fossil fuel companies are important, of course, they are not what we would ultimately want. I think as a society, what we want is better legislation. That is better legislation that will actually safeguard people's human rights. And so there has been a really important court case that has been completed in Germany this year. That was a Peruvian farmer that sued RWE, and while RWE didn't have to pay in the end because the court decided that the risk of flooding of his property is not imminent. What they made very, very clear in this judgment is that so RWE's one of their lines of defense was, but we have a permit. We're allowed to do this. We're allowed to dig out coal and burn it. We have a permit. It's under EU regulations, and the court says, yes, you have, but you still caused damages, and therefore you're liable for these damages. And I think that brought home really the key point that we would not have a permit to destroy lives and livelihoods in mountains. Ideally, we would have permits that are for businesses that don't have so huge damages. And I think that is the ultimate aim with these court cases. And that's also, there was earlier this year also the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice has also clarified very clearly that the Paris Agreement isn't a treaty that sort of exists in on its own in a vacuum, but it's part of a hugely important body of international law and international rules. And the overarching rule of this is do no harm. And I think that is well, ultimately, litigation can be one way of getting there, but ideally, we would obviously have our policymakers to do the legislation in the first place that would minimize the harm that is done to people. And I think if the attribution work can play a role in that, because it just shows just how much harm the current business models do, then that can only be a good thing. But it's not about going against individuals or going against, but it is, the ultimate aim is to safeguard human rights and human rights of all of us and not just business rights of very few.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, I feel like using the judicial system through litigation is about trying to enforce policies that are on the books that are not being enforced properly, right? And unfortunately, in a lot of places where there is so much fossil fuel capture or fossil fuel interest capture in the policymaking process, it's a really good way of holding the policymaking process accountable when they're captured in such a way. So, I mean, I think it has to be part of the solution in some ways, unless we figure out a way to get the policymakers to do what they need to do. So I guess that actually brings me to my last question for you both, which is, so we have right now the COP is taking place right now in Brazil. And, this is COP 30. And at the same time, we see expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure. We see companies claiming carbon dioxide removal in all sorts of ways and how that's going to play a role in their solutions moving forward. And we see a whole bunch of fossil fuel companies continuing to get subsidies to continue to extract natural resources around the world. So in that perhaps apocalyptically, realistic perspective, what do you see? Where do you think we're going? What do you see as the path here? And I'm hoping that your paths are hopeful, but I'm just curious based on the work that you do. Dave, you want to go first?
Hopeful. Have you seen what's happening to our country, Dana?
No, I haven't.
Yeah. There's some bumps.
Yeah, that's a good way of saying it. Bumps, sure.
Yeah, I don't know. It's I think it's hard to be hopeful at this moment, right? Maybe on a large scale you can say, okay, you look at how China is deploying renewable energy on a large scale, how they're making more money exporting renewable energy technology than the US is from exporting fossil fuels, even though the US is the largest oil and gas producer in the world. Like, that makes me hopeful, but the scale of how quickly we're bending that emissions curve is just too slow, right? And as long as we're putting in all this CO2 into the atmosphere, global temperatures are going to go up, and then these negative effects that Freddie was talking about earlier are going to continue, and they're going to get worse, and they're going to affect people who have contributed the least to this problem. And so unless, COP has some sort of breakthrough where they all of a sudden decide, hey, here is $1 trillion for the global south to transition to renewables and to adapt to climate change, I'm just going to be angry about how we all know what's happening and we're not doing anything about it.
I'm also angry, and I think I think there need to be more people angry about this corporate capture of COP, of our institutions, that we, no one is even subtle about it. It's no secret of how many fossil fuel lobbyists are at the COP. It's no secret of how many fossil fuel lobbyists pay huge sums to conservative politicians and so on. So it's not, it's happening in plain sight that our human rights are being sold, and it's not, we don't get anything for it. On the contrary, we have to pay extra with everything that we lose through the increasing impacts of climate change. So I think a lot more people need to be angry for there to be hope created on a slightly larger scale. But I think we do see a bit of that happening. So looking at New York and the election, the mayor elections there, that was a campaign that was not where he didn't let himself sort of be put in a corner and said, oh, you're a friend of a Muslim or whatever. And he said, yeah, of course. And of course we need all the people here, and we need migration, and that's what makes the city great. And we see similar things here in the UK with the Green Party having just more than doubled their members within the last few weeks after Zach Polanski has become leader, who also says the same thing, that sort of that environmental rights and the rights of humans are one of the same thing, and we can't improve the cost of living for poor people if we don't also do something about climate change. And I think seeing that, at least in some small parts, this narrative is being seen and is successful, that makes me hopeful. And I think to sort of go back on the larger scale, the geopolitical situation obviously is extremely cloudy at the moment, but the science is as clear as it has ever been, and also the law is as clear as it has ever been. So the legal framework in which the Paris Agreement and the COP operates, and I think that is also a reason to say, well, we have the right to demand that the process is getting better. And I think that is actually huge progress, and also a reason to create momentum and some hope. But yeah, it'll be hard work.
Yeah, I think building on what you said, we also saw similar successes in Boston and in Seattle in the United States recently. So there is a precedent at the local level, and I wonder if we'll see that in other places. I know that I've been very happy to watch from afar what's going on with the Greens in the UK. But certainly what we see, I think, is this kind of floating up from the local level, right? So we don't see this top-down approach, which in some ways is the structure that the climate regime has really leaned into quite a bit, is this very top-down approach. Even though there were bilaterals that led into the Paris Agreement, it's very much a top-down approach where countries kind of come to the table with their NDCs, and then there's this expectation of enforcement and that people will implement and follow the rules, and they're just not doing it. So, I mean, I see what you're saying about hope in the regime, but I also see the fact that the regime has, permitted the OPEC pavilion and permitted, fossil fuel folks. I mean, what is it? 25% of the people who are attending the climate negotiations this year are apparently affiliated with big ag, and big petroleum in some way or another. And it's just highly problematic, but it's being permitted and, facilitated by the way the regime is functioning, which makes me concerned. And I guess I lean into your anger, David, as well. I mean, I think there's lots to be angry about, and I am hopeful by the fact that I know from research that anger is a really good motivator and mobilizer for the people. So at least there's that. David, is there anything that gives you hope?
The fact that we have smart people like the two of you working on this problem.
Aww.
Americans are always so nice.
David is one of the nicest, though, whether or not he has his brown M&Ms. Well, I think, and let me just make sure I didn't ask. Well, I guess so. Okay. So say we come back and meet again in a few, let's say 5 years from now. All right. So it's 2030, and I say, hey guys, let's get back on the pod. We'll use new technology because this will be old and sad. And we talk again. What do you think the reality of where we're going to be is? Will there still be a climate regime? Will people still be flying to faraway places to debate, sitting next to fossil fuel, folks?
They will still debate, but they will not be sitting next to fossil fuel folks. At least far fewer. I think if they are still flying in 5 years' time, then they will not. I mean, I think either there is a reform of the process and actually a realization that this is not a stage for the fossil fuel industry to help themselves, but that this is a really successful regime that is for the countries, for the nations of this world to come together. So I think if that still happens in 5 years' time, then it will be more about actually nation states talking to each other, or and I mean real local people. I would think, because either it implodes or it is seriously reformed, or at least, I mean, probably not beautifully reformed. It won't be perfect, but I think that this COP, which was supposed to be better, is really not better, and no one had much hope for the last one and the one before, which were all in highly oil exporting countries. So I think that we have seen no change in this attitude with the Brazil COP, where everyone, when I was the last COP I was at was at Dubai, and everyone had super high hopes for Brazil that would be better. And so I think you can only be disappointed so many times before things need to change, I think.
I almost want to quote I almost want to quote our former president, George W. Bush, who said, first time you can fool me once, second time you fool me, you can't fool me again and again. But that was my paraphrasing of George W. Bush, if he's listening. But
his quote was much better.
Okay, fine, but you get... Yeah, I mean, there's only so many times that you should be convinced. Go ahead, David. We'll just cut that part.
I'm amazed by what Freddie just said, because that is way more hopeful than I am, and I thought she would be more cynical than me, and I don't see this process changing. I think they're just gonna keep doing what they're doing. I mean, the thing that I do appreciate about COP is that it forces organizations like the UN and other NGOs to put out these reports right before it, to say what a terrible job we're doing in terms of reducing emissions, or the our shortfall in adaptation and all this stuff. And that's great, right? Because it forces these timelines. So we have an annual report on just how terribly things are going.
But
And
forcing the
maybe
timeline, but just to push in here, like, so forcing the timeline, though, do you think that helps? I mean, certainly it means that we go, oh my God, it's even worse now. Oh, look,
Yeah.
it's even worse now.
So we don't know the counterfactual, right? We don't know how terrible things would be without COP. And I think I like to think, that maybe this is my hopeful part, is that I like to think things like COP and IPCC actually does something to make things better, even though they're not as good as we like them to be. They could possibly be worse. And so while I don't see like the process substantially changing, I mean, I think at least in 5 years, I think people are still going to fly to a place and do their dog and pony show, and then in the end, the rest of us will complain that, hey, they haven't achieved anything. The global South still isn't getting their loss and damage money and so on.
I'm not that optimistic that I think that will change, but I do think it will have to change just who is sitting at the table and who is going to the COP. Because I think what we have also seen in Brazil is that just local people, indigenous people, are getting angry that the fossil fuel lobbyists are treated so much better than everyone else. And I think so that's why I think that it will not be exactly the same people who are there, and I am hopeful that it will be a more useful set of people.
I mean, I think one of the other hopeful things, looking for hope in the COP this year, is that at least from what I've read, because I'm not there, my understanding is the indigenous pushback that we've been seeing has actually led to certain affordances from the Brazilian state, which actually suggests that this process is working best at the local level, which I think connects a lot to what you were saying before, Freddie, which is when we see people who are experiencing the climate crisis firsthand and pushing back against power at in an accessible way, we're seeing that they're able to get affordances. Now, will it solve the climate crisis? Will it stop deforestation in the Amazon? Will it limit, the access that fossil fuel interests get in their areas? I'm skeptical, but I mean, I think it provides a glimmer of hope to me. I mean, but I think I'm more on the Freddie side than on the David side, in fact, in terms of thinking about the trajectory for what the world's going to look like in 5 years, because I think that the degree to which the climate shocks are coming for us and these extreme events, which we've in some ways we've been really lucky that many places have avoided the worst of it so far. But I mean, like, there was just that paper that came out in Nature yesterday about extreme heat, and lives lost. I mean, it's just, we're right on the edge of a precipice, and that doesn't even think about these like tipping points and the cascading events and all of that. So the idea that in 5 years, the people are going to be able to be like, oh yeah, just one more COP. Let's go back to Brazil one more time. We can do it this time. I mean, I just think nobody's going to buy it anymore. I mean, at some point.
But Dana, so I think this is actually a study that Freddie was involved with that showed that if you're poor, the climate impacts that you experience happens a lot earlier than if you were living in a rich country and you're well off. And so I think it might be the case that in 5 years, these impacts are way worse, but they're happening to people that have no power. And
they're happening more to people with no power, but they're already happening to people with power as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, we have these events in the U.S. as well, right? Like we had Katrina, in 20 years ago, and we have hurricanes that go through, Florida and those Gulf states a lot, but each time, we just go back to business as usual. We don't actually do something about that.
Well,
And
if you look at the research about windows of opportunity that happen after these types of extreme events, there's been a lot of research that talks about how there has been local political change and resilience work and investment at the community level. And that could scale up. It has not yet. But my theory is that with work by Freddie and her team to be able to do more of this climate attribution, that could scale up in a much more effective way. I mean, but there's a lot of research around Hurricane Sandy, colleagues, I know worked on, but also Katrina, and also the more recent, extreme events. Although there is this misinformation pushback that we're seeing that we need to figure that one out. But I mean, I see what you're saying, David, and I agree with you that, I mean, people in poorer places, frontline communities of color, and developing countries are going to bear the brunt of this before we get to the other side of the climate crisis. I'm just hopeful that it'll come faster because of it. But and there's some research that says that at least there is hope there, not but we don't know yet if it will really work.
yeah, no, I hope you're right. In 5 years, one thing that I think will be different is, you see the tremendous build out of like solar and wind in China, and to some extent nuclear, and their adoption of electric vehicles. That's going to continue, right? And 5 years from now, it's going to be a different landscape. Hopefully, we have a different regime in our country, Dana, and that we will once again be okay with offshore wind and deployment of renewable energy and electrification and so on. That, yeah, I mean, the two biggest emitters in the world, if we could actually do something different, then it's already something. Yeah.
Freddie, any final thoughts? This got a little dark there, David. A little dark.
Yeah, and I think I would agree with you, Dana. It's not that nothing happens. I think what is not so what we, for example, see in Europe, that there has been an understanding actually how deadly heat is in recent years, and there have been also, not just in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, also on a city level, a lot of heat action plans. And of course, that at the moment is really much more on the adaptation level, on the saving lives. But I think that that is something is happening locally. And also I think there's much more. I mean, in London we have now the first death certificates where people put air pollution as the cause of death, and I think that is way too slow. But I think that this process of really connecting the dots on a local level, that the things that make our lives miserable are actually the things that are to a large degree all caused by this colonial fossil fuel worldview and narrative that we are being told. And I think that it is slow, and there's a huge pushback on big stages at the moment. But I think it is happening, and I think our job is to also help and make that visible, and see how that it works and how it improves lives.
Are you more hopeful now, David?
I'm the same as before. Yes.
Okay, fair enough. Well, I think that brings us to the end of the conversation for today. Thank you both for joining me for COPOut, Episode 4, and well, I guess, and stay tuned for COPOut Episode 5, which will be a postmortem with Catherine Hayhoe and Amy Westervelt, is next. But thank you again for joining me.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having us.